we are doing along with G20, the Task Force 5, where we are looking at the international economic order and various aspects of it. As you know, Foundation for Economic Growth is a research-oriented policy think tank situated in India. We are doing the special set of series, 12 of them, on various aspects that would be covered under Task Force 5. Today's talk is on climate finance, and we have with us, as you know, we have been following a certain practice. We have been calling across the world, bringing a blend of scholars from across the world, some Indian, some the best from the rest of the world. And today also, continuing in the same series, we are very fortunate to have again a blend of best scholars from across the world. To chair the session today, we have Dr. Arvind Virmani, who's the member of Niti Aayog, the government think tank in our country. He was earlier, of course, the chairman of EGROW Foundation. And before that, he was the executive director at the International Monetary Fund. He was the chief economic advisor of our country. He had been in the Planning Commission, and he has also been in the World Bank before that. He has published extensively and the planning. He has also books to his credit, lots of rigorous research. To chair the session today, we have invited Dr. Arvind Virmani, and despite his challenging health, he is here with us. Our first speaker for the day is Mr. Amar Bhattacharya. I've known him for nearly 15 years now, met him when I was at the IMF and he was there. He's a visiting professor in practice at the Grantham Research Institute at London School, and he is working closely with Lord Stern and his team on international finance, climate action, and sustainable growth, as well as economic and climate policies in India. He is a senior fellow at in the Center for Sustainable Development, housed in the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings Institution. From April 2007 until September 2014, he was director of the Group of 24 and government at the Fed Reserve.
Vivek, are you there? Is something wrong with Dr. Charan Singh's connection?
I will tell him to join again.
Yes, yeah, sir. I think he has to restart because I messaged him. He's getting my message. Okay, there he is.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know what went wrong. I apologize. So I was introducing our second speaker, Professor Galina Hale from University of California, Santa Cruz. I had known her earlier when she was teaching at Stanford, and she was also serving as a research advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank, San Francisco. She has done her initial studies at in Russia, and then she has her PhD in economics from UC Berkeley under the supervision of Barry Eichengreen. Barry Eichengreen is going to be again on our forum in the next few weeks. Galina's research interests lie in three main areas, and one of that is very fascinating, understanding patterns of international capital flows. That's when I first learned about her research, stability of financial system, and the nexus between ESG sustainability goals and financial system. She has published her work in top research journals, and she has also been acting at our camps. She has also worked extensively in foreign direct investment. She co-wrote with Cheryl Long of monograph Foreign Direct Investment in China, Winners and Losers. And I was thinking one of these days after the G20 series, going to request her to come and talk to us about that. She is currently serving as a co-editor of the Russian Journal of Central Banking, associate editor of the Journal of International Economics, and a member of the editorial board of the IMF Economic Review and Pacific Economic Review. She has co-edited special issues of the Journal of International Economics and of Economic Review. Galina is a director of EGROW's Cruise Center for the CAFIN. She served and she is athletic. I have seen training long time in a field and travel the day is Suranjali Tandon. Suranjali Tandon is assistant professor at National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in Delhi, where she leads the work on direct taxation and sustainable finance. She is currently a member of the T20 Task Force on Refueling Growth, Clean Energy, and Green Transition. She has been a special invitee to the Task Force on Sustainable Finance, India set up under the aegis on Ministry of Finance, and is an expert invitee to International Financial Services Center Authorities Subcommittee on Sustainable Finance related to disclosures. She is an expert advisor to India Lab by Climate Policy Initiative and Ola Mobility Institute. She has worked in the past on many projects with the Department of Revenue and Department of Economic Affairs Ministry, government, on key policy issues. She is the Chevening Financial Services Fellow 2019 at King's College London and has a PhD in economics from JNU, India. With this, I hand over the session to our chairman, Dr. Arvind Virmani, please.
Thank you, Charan. So let me just kind of ramble a bit before I hand it over to my old friend Amar Bhattacharya. In 2010-12, when I was at the IMF in Washington, D.C., we used to spend long hours trying to discussing the massive infrastructure needs of the middle income countries and things like arcane things like the capital base of MDIs, how to leverage private capital. 10 years later, nothing much seems to have happened on that front. But here we are, on the conventional infra finance, but here we are now talking about climate finance. So what is climate finance and what will be its fate? We have three very knowledgeable people who Charan has just introduced. So let's get straight into it. And I will kind of have my own questions and comments as we go along. So with that, over to you, Amar.
Thank you, Arvind. I'm petrified by the instability of digital connections. So I hope this one stays stable. I am actually in the beautiful city of Venice and for for a big meeting on climate finance, but notwithstanding how beautiful it is outside, I want to really use this seminar to the fullest. So, my only nervousness is the stability of the digital connections. So I have a PowerPoint presentation, which I'm going to share. And I won't go through all of it, but we'll be very glad to make it available. Let me see. So you should see on the screen a presentation, and I'm going to go to the presentation mode. And basically, I'm going to present, the findings of the work of a commission, of which I was the executive secretary and the principal author of the report. So, which relates very much to the topic. And the starting point of it is exactly where Arvind started, which is, when we talk about climate, finance is finance for what? And, we're really talking largely about financing of infrastructure. And before we called it financing of sustainable infrastructure, but now we talk about it as green infrastructure. And, there's a lot of, there's a lot of overlap between the two. So I'm going to quickly, sorry, I don't know, it's not moving right now. I was asked to do something by somebody, and that's taken the power away from me. So let me see if it won't let me escape from this either. So
I can see your slides.
Sorry?
We can see your
No,
slides.
but I can't move it anymore. Manpreet asked me to do something, and I accepted, and now it's taken the control away from me. So, and I can't even see I don't know why.
Amar, you could send us the deck and we can
It's
check
okay.
from the
Let's
site.
just no. I don't know what was done, but it took away the power from me. So I'm quite happy to do it without the slides. It's all right. I'm perfectly comfortable. So let me begin by my first point, which is that we are at a critical moment in time, which is why the focus on climate finance. Why? Because we are still in the middle of the worst crisis or polycrises that emerging markets and developing countries have seen. That crisis has resulted in a major dimming of economic growth prospects. India is less affected, but still affected, and other countries much more, particularly the continents of Africa and Latin America, highly affected by this, and we are at a risk of a lost decade for development. Second, we are off track on virtually every SDG that was set as targets for 2030. And third, we are off track on the climate goals at a time when emerging markets and developing countries account now for 75% of incremental of emissions at an annual basis, and where they are the most affected by climate change. At the same time, because of changes in technology and a recognition of the harmful costs associated with the past forms of growth, we are at the advent of a much better, stronger, more durable, and more environmentally friendly model of growth. But in order to seize this opportunity, the world will need to invest, because that's the only way in which we change old capital. It's the only way we deliver on new capital, especially on infrastructure. And for that also, we will need financing, and financing at scale. Okay, so we are at a moment of grave risk, but we are also at a moment of great opportunity. And in this, the technological possibilities are really quite important, not just as we keep talking about renewables, but in many, many areas, from transport to electric mobility, to land and use and agriculture, food systems, shipping, industry, the so-called hard to abate sectors. So we really have in prospect right now that we could push the world economy onto a growth path, which really does avoid the harmful, wasteful, models of the 20th century growth model. And this is something particularly, I mentioned this particularly for Arvind, given his focus on growth. Yes, growth, but this is about a better form of growth, more sustainable, stronger, more resilient, more inclusive. In order to do this, as I said, we need to ramp up investment. How much? So if we, work that Homi Kharas and I have done, shows that if the world really wants to kind of meet the SDG goals, we would need to roughly double investment from the levels that we were in pre-COVID to 2030 for something like about $2.4 trillion a year in emerging markets other than developing countries to about 5.8 trillion by 2030. That's about, an incremental growth of about 6 to 7% of GDP. It's a big step, but it's not an impossible step. It's quite reasonable given the growth and given that a lot of this is growth enhancing. So it's an investment, it's not a cost. Within this, and in some sense, is climate-related investments. So what do we mean by climate-related investments? At the heart of climate-related investments is transformation of energy systems. That means ensuring that new energy comes as much as possible from renewables, that we invest in the complementary investments to make renewable energy viable, especially in the grid, but also in backup and storage, that we transform demand so that, new demand, that demand is increasingly electrified and that electricity can be provided by renewable energy. And in order to do also the energy transformation, we need to be mindful that exiting from fossil fuel energy is a plus, but it will have transitional costs, and particularly associated with coal and employment in coal, and the fact that a lot of assets are still stuck in coal. So the just transition issues, very important. Second, we are in the face of massive impact of climate change. Somebody has to pay for that, what we call loss and damage. And at the moment, the mechanisms for that are inadequate. Why? Some of it is insurable, but most of it is not. And we do not have adequate mechanisms for loss and damage. How much do we think we need for loss and damage? I'll come to that in a second. Third, the faster we invest in adaptation and resilience, the less will be the costs, the greater the economic gains, but we are massively underinvesting in adaptation and resilience. And finally, we all talk about climate, but we need to talk beyond climate to natural capital. We need to invest in sustainable agriculture. We need to invest in degraded land, in forests, and in biodiversity. All of these are assets, and we are, again, at the moment, massively underinvesting in it. Partha Dasgupta, did an analysis on biodiversity, for example, and he said, if the world invested properly in biodiversity, the GDP payoff would be as much as 0.5% of GDP. So it's actually even quite closely related to sustainable growth. Now, as I said, the three big areas of investment are transformation of energy systems, responding to loss and damage and adaptation, and nature. So these are areas where the growth of investment needs are the greatest. As I said, for SDGs, we need to double investment, but for the climate-related areas that I mentioned, we need to increase investment fourfold within this decade. Why? because of the imperative around the energy transformation and because we are massively underinvesting in adaptation, resilience, and nature. So roughly, we estimate that we are spending something like 500 to 600 billion at the moment in climate-related investments, and we need to increase that to 2.4 trillion per annum by 2030. So of that, we think about 1.4 trillion will come from domestic sources, increasingly from private. Most of it historically has come from public, but we think private finance can play a big role in the domestic side. And on the international side, we argue that we will need about 1 trillion in external financing by 2030 per year. And as you can see, that number is 10 times more than the 100 billion that had been talked about forever in the context of the UNFCCC climate accords. But it's a very different kind of number. The second point I want to make, and this is an important point, is when we talk about finance, it is finance for what? And each of the types of investments that we are talking about, require different kinds of finance. And so to start with, there are many activities now that could be largely financed by private investment if the policy environment is reasonable. And the governments can, in some sense, only focus on the policy environment and allow those investments to move ahead. That includes, for example, a lot of renewables, not all of renewables, a lot of renewables. It includes aspects of e-mobility and green hydrogen and the like. There is no need for public involvement in the financing as such. But there is an equally large component where we will need some kind of public enhancement of private finance. Why? Because of three reasons. One is the enabling environment. We don't necessarily have, in some sense, the unlocking of the investment opportunities. Second, because of risks, and those risks encompass exchange rate risk, policy-induced risks, such as offtake risk in the Indian context, risks associated with the discoms, and third, credit and aggregation risk. So we need mechanisms for risk mitigation. But even if you mitigate those risks, in many emerging markets and developing countries, the cost of capital is very high. And this is particularly a problem with infrastructure and, not just climate infrastructure, but all infrastructure, because the payback period is very long. So, it's fine to talk about private finance, but if the cost of capital is very high, then finance is a problem, not a solution. And that's true, by the way, for many, many developing countries and many middle-income countries, including countries like Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, and the like. So the cost of capital is a very big issue. Third, development finance is a very big role to play. First of all, we need local development finance institutions because there are a lot of public good aspects associated with it, and because there are coordination issues with development finance institutions are well placed to tackle. India is one of the major countries without a major development finance system. When you look at India's development finance system and you compare it with China or South Africa or Brazil, we have a very, very rudimentary development finance system. And that is a handicap for us because in some sense, some of these investments and the cost of capital and coordination issues becomes a little bit more challenging. In the regional institutions can play a big role, but ultimately, of course, we need to scale up multilateral institutions, and this is a big issue of the day. As you know, we have a new nominee for the World Bank president. Everybody is looking now for a major revamp of the MDB system, and the MDB system is operating at a level which is in some sense, almost insignificant in terms of the scale of the needs. In this report that I mentioned, we argue that MDB finance needs to be trebled within the next 5 years. And that's the kind of scale, and we need to go beyond the MDB system to the entire development bank system, bilaterals and national as well. So the last part I want to mention is that concessional finance will be very, very important. Because why? Because we need money for adaptation and resilience. We need money for adaptation and for loss and damage, for adaptation and resilience in vulnerable countries, for just transitions. These require, largely concessional finance. The international donor community has, not delivered on its commitments, and there is no way that we are going to get the scale of finance just from that. So there's a lot of discussion going on right now around what ways we can expand that pool of finance. So let me just mention a few things in the context of the G20, because this is about G20. So where do we see the impetus on this agenda coming from? So first, the advent of a new president in the World Bank gives us an opportunity to really scale up ambition in a way that we have not been able to do for the last 20 years. And this is not just about the World Bank, it is even more importantly about the shareholders of the World Bank, getting them aligned behind this idea of scale, of urgency, and the catalytic role that the multilateral development banks can play. So that's the first. Second, there is a summit coming up in June, which is which was launched by President Macron in partnership with Prime Minister Motley of Barbados, bringing very much the perspective of vulnerable countries to this. France has reached out to India, and India has agreed to co-chair that June summit. So there will be a link between the Indian G20 presidency and the summit. And that summit will look at very much what can we do to scale up. It's being called a summit on a new global financing pact. So, what are the elements of finance? And they are the three that I mentioned: a major ramp up in private finance, a transformation of the MDB system so that it is fit for purpose, and third, delivering concessional finance at scale. I think that the value of that will primarily be on the last point, trying to find innovative ways, to try and mobilize low-cost finance, such as, taxes on maritime fuel, voluntary and compliant carbon markets, use of SDRs, lots of different things on the table. I think on the MDB side, it will not be a major place of action, and I'll come to that in a second. But it will highlight its importance, and in a similar way, private finance. So then comes the G20. So the G20 under the G20 Indian presidency is already emphasizing the interlinkages between the SDG financing and climate financing, and the criticality of MDB finance in that regard. So the G20 Indian presidency has launched a new group, expert group, which will be co-chaired by Larry Summers and Dr. N.K. Singh, with a really blue ribbon panel of members. And they will, kind of move. They are moving very quickly, and they will make their recommendations to the July meeting of the finance ministers with a final report by the October meeting. And we hope that that will set, in some sense, a more ambitious track around, what the MDBs need to do and what's a roadmap to deliver on that. We are also, this year looking for a major kind of revamp on what I call creating a new highway for private finance and what that would take with an eye on the cost of capital. So these three elements, a new kind of focus on concessional finance, a revamp of the MDB system, and mobilizing private finance at scale would be the three elements of driving a new climate finance agenda. Now, as you can see, this is very, very far from the kind of, the 100 billion in the UNFCCC context. But I'll end with one final point, that all of the talk on finance is academic unless you can translate investment needs into realized investment opportunities. Because at the moment, as people who are providing the finance will say, the problem is not the availability of finance, it's the fact that there aren't really good investment propositions on which that finance can be deployed. So the final area where there's a lot of focus is platforms to scale up, in some sense, investments in the kind of coal-dependent economies. These are being called just energy transition partnership programs. South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam leading, everybody hoping, of course, that India would be a big part of that. But, this doesn't have to be limited to coal and phase out of coal. It is actually about all of the elements that I mentioned. Can we use platforms as a way to kind of, be much more purposive around investment propositions and around the actions necessary to kind of ensure that the policy binding constraints are tackled and around the financing that will be necessary for this finance. It can be long-term, and it is something that at least I believe that Niti Aayog, for example, could really play a key role in laying out a structure of thinking so that we are not supporting climate, but we are supporting sustainable infrastructure where climate is an important co-benefit. Thank you. Thank you, Charan. Thank you, Arvind.
Thank you, Amar.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, well, you've given us a good overview, as I hope for. So let us turn now to Professor Galina Hale for her remarks. Professor.
Thank you so much. I totally agree with the previous speaker. Let me try to share the slides. Give me a second. Window, this one. Can you see my slides? And you can still hear me. Okay, excellent. So I want to talk about a two-way connection between the financial system and the climate. And the first one is something we've been talking about for 10 years, which is the climate risk for financial system. And those come from, regulatory risks or credit risks or collateral. So it's a combination of transition risks and physical risks. And what we're talking more now is how can financial system contribute to climate solutions? And I'm going to show some charts just to get the idea of the scale that we're talking about. And the reason we were talking about financial risks initially is because the idea was if only financial institutions price climate risks correctly, they're going to start moving funds out of emitting industries and into solution industries. And it is happening, but it's happening very, very slowly. So now we need to turn conversation, because of the urgency of the climate problem, we need to turn conversation into catalyzing financial sector into investment in climate solutions for reasons other than risk. And the reasons other than risk that financial sector has, of course, is profitability. So the question is, how do we make climate investment profitable? And I'll talk about that a little bit at the end, but I want to give a little bit of an overview of the risk part first. So I think it's probably not new to anybody, but just to fix ideas, the physical risks are the risks that arise from the manifestation of the climate change. We used to think of those as future risk, Now we need to think of them as a current risk. I'm sure in India, as much as in California, where I am, the climate-related weather changes are obvious and they're affecting everybody. Can people hear me? I see the comments that there is no, okay. And so physical risks are relatively easy to measure because the climate science community provided us with all kind of geolocational data. And, you know, if you just overlay it with the location of properties and communities, you can calculate those risks. And that's where we now need to invest a lot in the adaptation solution for the most vulnerable communities to protect them from those climate risks that are no longer in the future, but now actually are here today. And, you know, when I think about physical risks, I think about the acute risks, such as, you know, fire, flood, and storm, but there are also chronic risks. And people think, well, okay, the temperature is going to increase on average for, you know, 1.5, 2 degrees if we're lucky. But that's not the right way to think about it. The right way to think about it is the whole distribution of temperature and precipitation has fatter tails. So the cold places get colder, hot places get hotter, dry places get drier. Okay, this winter in California is very unusual. But essentially, if you think about, you probably know the data on India better than I do, but in California, in Central Valley, where it gets really hot in the summer, the temperature is already 5 degrees higher than normal in the summer. And that's a very large increase for agriculture and for people's ability to survive. So in terms of transition risks, and I don't know why. For financial institutions, we usually talk about it just coming from the policies, such as carbon tax. But I think because the policies have been pretty slow to move in the last 20 years, people might be underestimating the extent of transition risk. So transition risk comes from the possibility that fossil fuel assets become stranded if the demand for them drops precipitously, right? So carbon tax could be one reason, but it's probably not happening in most of the world. But there could be also other sources, right? We can develop a technology and a lot of people are working on developing a technology that is going to replace fossil fuels with something more, you know, cheaper and accessible. Again, in California, producing energy now with rooftop solar is cheaper than any other way with the gas prices that increased quite a bit. Okay, you can annotate. So the technology is another source of transition risk. There is also consumer and investor preferences, right? So consumers and investors can decide to start driving the transition to the green, you know, the green transition without any kind of regulation by refusing to participate in anything that is funding further greenhouse gas emissions. I'll skip this. I can share. Everybody can see my slides. I'll share the link to my slides after I'm done talking. So a couple of things I wanted to mention is, you know, there is a big discussion of climate disclosure. And it's a little bit of a back and forth, obviously, between the industry and the governments have to negotiate. And they tend to say, okay, well, scope 3 emissions, which are emissions from upstream and downstream connections to the firms, well, these are hard to measure, so maybe we don't need to disclose them. And my pet peeve is that unless you disclose scope 3 emissions, the disclosure is basically useless. Because first of all, we can have multinationals shift their inputs from country to country. They can choose to, if they don't have to report scope 3, they can simply spin off some of their upstream subsidiaries to make them not part of their company. And then they just purchase their inputs and they no longer have to disclose related emissions. And in a, I don't know if you've seen a famous example where Tesla got a bad ESG score because the car company can have zero emissions. They can use renewables to produce the cars, but if it's an internal combustion car, the downstream emissions from driving it is a scope 3 emission. And of course, financial institutions only have scope 3 emissions, right? They use energy to run computers, but that's very minor. And so if you don't disclose scope 3, then financial institutions are not incentivized to make any changes in their behavior. So it's, whenever disclosure is discussed without scope 3, I'm a little bit concerned. Another thing I want to mention, so my other pet peeve is the ESG ratings. So a lot of research is coming out with ESG ratings used to analyze their effects. One thing to notice is that pretty much across all the providers, the very common practice is that ratings are scaled within the industry. So you can have a trucking company that has a better ESG rating than, say, a shoe manufacturer, right? And the shoe manufacturer has a lot less emissions, but because they're only rated within their industry, you do not see their actual carbon footprint. And so this is perfectly fine if you're running regressions with industry fixed effects and things like that. But if you're a financial institution trying to assess your transition risk of investing into a company, those relative ESG ratings are actually not helpful at all, because they do not give you a kind of a cardinal measure of the risk. They only give you the ordinal measure within the industry. Okay, so turning to the solutions. So what Professor Bhattacharya was saying, I think is kind of shown on this chart. My numbers are even bigger than his. So this is from IPCC. We're currently investing about $600 billion a year for climate solutions. And in order to get under 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to scale it up to 6 trillion a year, so tenfold by 2040. And this is a huge amount, right? And it cannot come from the governments. The governments don't have that money. The nonprofits don't have that money. The only sector that has that money is the private financial sector. They're about $200 trillion under management globally. And so we're talking about 3% of total assets under management. So when you start thinking that way, it doesn't sound like the task of catalyzing those 3% to be invested in climate solution is really that daunting, right? Because we only need 3% of investment to be redirected to something that is solving the problem. You probably can't see because it's small, but currently the money is coming from public sector. This is the green part. It comes from some companies. There are very small slice coming from nonprofits. This black part here is the banks. And the other financial sector, this red arrow is pointing, is the tiny, tiny slice you can't even see over here. Okay, so we really need to get non-banking financial institutions to start moving money to climate solutions. Now, what solutions? Again, because the climate change is here, we need to start thinking more about adaptation in addition to mitigation, right? So yes, we need to do anything we can to prevent catastrophic warming of the planet. But since we already here experiencing losses because of the climate change manifestation, we now need to, invest in protecting people and property and nature. And investment in adaptation is absolutely tiny, coming from a lot of it coming from nonprofit. It's coming from, the Nature Conservancy is leading the charge on this. Coming from local governments that don't have much money at all, comes from infrastructure ministries to protect public infrastructure. But generally, this is something we need to figure out how to fund. And the logic here is very simple, right? So we invest in mitigation to prevent losses that might be 50 years down the road that occur to everybody on the planet. So yet we found a way in carbon markets to actually trade it as an asset. Adaptation projects provide protection in a very short time frame to very well-defined communities. And so it shouldn't be too hard to figure out how to get them funded, because the returns are a little bit more tangible, in fact. I'll skip that. So why don't we see more finance coming to the climate solutions? As Professor Bhattacharya mentioned, it's a complex temporal profile of payoffs. The money, the returns on investment come in the form of losses being avoided. And those losses are avoided are in the future. So it's not very easy to financialize them, which means to create a cash flow that the financial institution wants to see. And the payoffs tend to be distributed across stakeholders. So you need to combine all these people to create a financial instrument. And then there are, of course, greenwashing risks and other risks that are specific to the climate investment. And scale is also a big one. So there are a few things that people are thinking about how to overcome those challenges. Structured finance with NGO participation and government support. If you're interested, have a look at how the Nature Conservancy created the blue bond for Belize and Seychelles islands for the debt to nature conversion, with private sector participating, US government providing guarantees, nonprofit putting in some capital and equity and liquidity. In terms of scale, there is quite a bit of fintech discussion here in Silicon Valley, where I am, with tokenizing some of this investment so that each of us can, contribute a few bucks and to build a carbon capture plant or something like that. And we need more financial innovation. We have financial innovation. We need to marry it with the need for investment in climate solutions. I'll skip this one, but this is one that I'm thinking on is, there's got to be climate solutions that are profitable for financial institutions. We just need to figure out how to find them, how to price them, how to structure them, and how to package them and sell them. And then some of them need to have a little bit of a boost, right? So Professor Bhattacharya was saying the cost of capital is high and maybe the return on those investments are not very high. Well, one way to boost the ROI, if you can get some of the investment part from government on NGO grant, then the return on remaining portion of investment that can come from private sector is going to be higher. Okay, I'll skip this. The last thing I want to say, everybody is focusing on CO2, and CO2 is by far the biggest greenhouse gas we're emitting, but the other two main gases that are contributing to global warming are methane and nitrous oxide. And those mostly come from agriculture. And they're very, very potent. And the good news, if there is any good news about methane, is if we can reduce the emissions of methane, the methane does not stay in the atmosphere as long as the CO2. So we get a more immediate bang for the buck. And so addressing the animal agriculture, we still have a very fast growth of, consumption of animal-based products. And we need to slow down this growth and try to feed the growing population with plant-sourced food. And so we need investment in that and innovation in that. And of course, in India, the share of animal agriculture is much, much lower than in any other country, but it's growing very fast. And so there's something that, maybe we need to leapfrog to, back to healthier diets, I would say. And so I'm just going to leave you with the conclusion that, climate change poses substantial stability risks to the international financial system. But it's not enough for the financial system to just be aware of those risks. We really need to find a way to make climate solutions profitable, to attract this private sector money, because we have a lot of private sector money. And there was a question in the chat, isn't that all discussion about advanced economies? Well, global capital markets are global. If there is a profitable investment project in India, global investors, global private investors can contribute to that. I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you. I'll post the link in the chat.
Thank you, Professor. Let me turn to our last speaker.
Thank you.
Tandon, who hopefully will give us a little more of the India perspective now to some of the things she feels there in the Indian approach. Over to you.
Thank you, sir. I'm unable to share my slides because I'm not a co-host, but perhaps I can just speak.
Please try again.
Great, thank you. I can share. I hope everyone can see my slide. And
Got it.
perfect. Thank you so much. It's really hard to say something innovative and new after the last two speakers. But what I'm going to do is to sort of step back and sort of speak about what is climate finance, why it's important and what are the different elements of it, sort of tie the whole system and then talk about what we've seen in climate finance in India. I think it needs no further, deliberation or conversation on why climate finance is important. We've seen and in fact even felt the changing weather. I think if you're in any city in India, you would witness the volatility in weather. And I think the IPCC's report as well corroborates this with rather ominous predictions over the next couple of decades. In COP27, which is the annual gathering where there is conversation about climate finance, there have been estimates, and previous speakers have already alluded to this number. It's $4 to $6 trillion. While it is large, I would caution that this is to be raised over the next few decades, and every country set their net zero target. So if we were to look at a healthy growth in GDP, perhaps it is doable. It's not just to say that climate functions on its own. There is also the SDGs that we've set ourselves as a target to be reached by 2030. And I see some complementarity between the numbers on climate finance as well as an SDG financing. When we talk about climate finance, there are two basic elements which have been spoken of. One is adaptation and the other is mitigation, right? So one is that the effects of climate change are being witnessed now and felt now, and these costs have to be paid for. So for example, if we saw what happened in Pakistan earlier, it costed it $30 billion in terms of the floods that had caused economic damage. On the other hand, you have mitigation, which means that if countries are to reach the net zero target, they have to switch their way of doing business, the way of economic activity takes place, and therefore rely less on fossil fuels. And therefore, all sectors, for example, steel, cement, which are often referred to as hard to abate, will also have to change their processes. And so all of this would individually require investment by different agents in the economy. And that leads me to my next slide, wherein I'll stress the point again that, what we're talking about in climate finance is to say that all the externalities that were earlier priced out were not incorporated within the mathematics of a business now need to be incorporated well. And how do we do that now? So if we look at the whole financing space, it has many participants, right? So in India, we know that commercial banks are a major source of funding, be it for business or personal loans. And these commercial banks are mandated to put aside some money, which is supposed to be for statutory regulations for complying with them, as well as for some priority sector lending. Now, if we are to imagine that economies have to change the way they operate, these levers that are so far being used to regulate banks as well could shift, could change as well to incorporate climate within it. And I think it's been spoken of before. You could have more stringent capital adequacy norms. You could have priority sector lending to climate change. Aligned activities in the sense that these are activities which help with the transition, and lending could be made to these sectors. So I think commercial banks is the first important sector. It's all, the previous speaker was also talking about risks. What we've seen over the last One here is that the Reserve Bank of India has been exceptionally receptive to this risk. There was the release of the Sustainable Finance Report. We've also seen the statement from the governor stating that there will be stress on green deposits. There would be a supervisory framework of climate-related risks within India, which is to say that, on the side of risks, there would be an acknowledgement of what this is in the existing financial system. And on the side of investment, there would be promotion of green deposits, which in a sense lead to lending to sectors which are aligned with this transition. I think it's natural to say that companies are the affected and the effectors of climate. All of us who've studied economics remember the example on externality, which is a steel plant which pollutes water, and that water flows to a city and causes health costs or raises health costs for individuals. And in a sense, the rethinking around climate is to make companies pay. Now, there are different ways in which the government has approached this. We've looked at the trend with corporate social responsibility within India, which is not just climate, it goes beyond that. It talks about a company meeting its duty to the society. But I think what we are now witnessing is a paradigm shift on how companies are held responsible for their activities. And so in this regard, you have different disclosure frameworks wherein companies must disclose their emissions, they must disclose their sustainability and responsibility sort of performance, and the investors use this information actively. So one way that private finance can act is by investing in companies that are relatively compliant and desist from investing in companies that are non-compliant. So India has its own framework, which is called the BRSR, which now is mandated for top 1,000 listed companies. This is extremely useful for those who are investing based on ESG metrics, as we call it. Within this ecosystem, I think it's very important and needs to be underscored is the role of rating agencies. Now, in the past, we've seen that rating agencies have been slow. They have not been able to adapt their thinking quickly to the financials of a firm. And what we're seeing initially, even in India, is that rating agencies are not able to parse through this information that is reported in BRSR or BRR, which was earlier, and compare companies. Primarily because a lot of this is qualitative information. And to sort of work through that and say which company is investable, which one is more compatible is difficult. But I think towards the climate end, it seems it's more measurable. I would suggest that, reforming the rating agencies and how they adapt to climate change is a very important function within climate finance. There's been some talk about development banks, and I don't want to dwell on that very much because it's been spoken of, but they seem to perform a very important function because within the spectrum of climate finance, there will be activities which will not attract private finance. Why is that so? Because all of us, having read Economics 101, know that there are some places private finance will not go for lack of returns. And so therefore, that brings me to the other point, which is not just development banks, but public finance is critical to climate finance. There are two aspects of public finance related to climate which need specific attention. One is that, when you are promising to go off fossil fuels, these are also part of revenue for many countries. So for example, India collects about 17% of its total taxes from fossil fuels. And if we are to go down the path of phasing down all fossil fuels eventually, then there will be a loss in revenue. At the same time, there are requests to scale up incentives as well as to fund activities which are aligned with climate goals, but are not necessarily funded by private sector. And so therefore, public finance remains absolutely critical to the conversation. There has been emergence of a new kind of financing instrument, which in a sense speaks to this gaping void between private finance and public finance, that is sectors to which private finance won't go and public finance hasn't reached, and these are philanthropies. What we're seeing is social impact investments, though small in scale, promise an outcome and have a full-scale model to deliver a particular kind of social outcome. And the returns are obviously muted. So I think all of them come together to form what we call is climate finance. Each of these have a use case. They are influenced by what the purpose in mind is. This, of course, is important in the sense that regulators need to take attention. So what I've already mentioned is that the RBI has responded. We've also seen the Securities Exchange Board of India being extremely receptive to the demands. The BRSR, as I was saying, that is mandatory for companies, is being implemented by SEBI. We also have the CSR implemented by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. So climate finance, in a sense, has grown and scaled in at least regulatory imagination. And what we would imagine is that over the next few years, we would need to do something on the policy side to attract private capital. See, at the end of the day, even if we call it climate finance, it is some of it is private finance, which is driven by all kinds of incentives. And what we've learned from experiences within financial markets is that capital is extremely volatile. So in order to hold this capital or attract this capital would require regulatory changes, which would be, as I said, in the form of incentives or in the form of regulatory advantages. We're already seeing that in some way. So, for example, India has its own offshore financial center called the IFSC, wherein there are tax incentives and there are regulatory relaxations which are available for finance to move in. The question then is to wait and watch how much of this finance will actually flow into India. At this point, I think I also want to mention that this is not clearly thought of as just finance. These are also regulatory measures, but it's always nice to split up the thinking on what can be done on climate finance. See, there is one way to do it, which is tried and tested in EU. The success has been limited because of various reasons, but without having to delve into the technicalities of each of these, you have the emission trading system, which is an important mechanism, because what it does is to put a cap on the emissions from a particular sector, and then sectors respond with change. These caps can then be traded. In the sense, you can any emissions saved can be traded, and we've seen many years of experience within the market. There are many other developing countries that have also considered. So, for example, China has set up its own markets, which were earlier at the provincial level, but now will be scaled up to the national level. We've seen that in Korea and other countries. And it is one way to tell the business that it's not going to continue as usual. There will be a price attached to their actions. What this does is that the businesses begin to also charge an internal carbon price. So what we've seen in experience is that many of the large companies begin to price carbon internally based on their functions and emissions, and then based on that make an investment allowance. And I think this is a very strong lever. Other than just the trading system, you also have carbon taxes, and I think this relates back to the point about public finance. So if you're going to have a tapering down of the revenues for countries, there's going to be demand for investment, which to my mind is going to be spatially diverse. So for example, there will be regions which will be more affected even within a country like India, and so therefore would require specific thinking on public finance. I think there a tax would be extremely important. The IMF has carried out significant work on what the right range of carbon tax may be. There are obviously equity effects. For example, it could be that if it's very high, it could affect lower decile incomes, and so therefore needs to be thought through. But at the same time, it's a good way to nudge a company to begin to think about how to operate. So even in response to the existing taxes that we have, so we all know that India has an excise tax, it has GST, and it has royalties that it applies to different fossil fuels. All of these taxes today in some way are a burden for companies, which they tend to price in to their activities through an internal carbon price. So some of the large corporates do that already. So I think those two pricing strategies, which is of cap and trade and of carbon tax, are an important financial regulatory measure and can help raise climate finance within countries such as India. And the non-pricing measures, as I've already mentioned, are all the disclosures that corporations need to make, either when they issue equity or when they could issue special kind of debt. So we've heard about India's sovereign green bond, but there are companies in India that have been issuing green bonds for some time, and these are allocated to specific activities aligned with their transition plans. And so therefore, disclosures which allow investors to hold the company responsible for what is being promised on paper is another important lever of climate finance. That being said, everyone is going to ask, where is the money going now? This particular graph is a stock update on where is money flowing in India in the green finance space. So, we talk about climate finance, and there's a bigger sort of bucket to talk about green finance. So what we see here is that so far, the green finance has flown from commercial financial institutions, corporations, and to small extent from foreign direct investment. And this is residential, commercial, and institutional. So what this really shows is that the green space, perhaps, which would be investments in clean transportation, clean energy, and energy efficiency, has received money largely from the private sector. Of course, only a part of it may be climate. It goes much beyond this green. Then you have, we spoke about multilateral banks. We spoke about international finance, but as you see from here, multilateral DFIs are a very small proportion, and the remaining comes from public budgets. So and this is where we're talking about, there could be business cases here. So what this really reflects is that perhaps even if, there is a change of heart within corporates, some of it will really come from the public sector, and a lot of it in India could come from the domestic investor community. So when we think about plans to transition as well as raising of climate finance, it is important to keep this in mind to understand what kind of policy levers may be required and what particular instruments are already available. I'll just end quickly by just saying that I think it's important to keep in mind that public finance will remain critical, even though we are seeing some business case in the renewable sector, and it's a full spectrum of instruments. So we've seen that even in SDGs, we're running out of time. There's a 4.2 trillion gap there, but we're only seeing investments going through the climate-related SDGs. And so therefore, I think a thought needs to be put in on what are these instruments, how much can be raised from them to meet each of the climate-related activities. So I'll just stop there and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So before I kind of call on
Thank
other people. There's one issue which was raised by Amar, I think, which is kind of important. It's come up a number of times recently too, in my notice also. And that is the issue of the development finance institution. Now, as some of you know, there was a period in which we decided that these development finance institutions were no longer viable without subsidies, and we kind of decided to abandon them. But I guess some people never gave up, including our friend Rakesh Mohan, who always wanted an infrastructure finance institution. Amar, I presume when you said the lack of a development financing system in India, you are referring to something like that? So can I ask you to comment on that before?
Indeed, I was commenting on that. I mean, it's absolutely true that development finance institutions in not just India, but in developing countries have had a checkered history. But the point I'm making is that given the types of investment we are financing and the kind of structural impediments that were pointed out by Professor Hale, we need in some sense mechanisms for long-term finance that in some sense recognize the externalities surrounding it, the public good nature of it, tackle in some sense some of the coordination issues, deal with risk mitigation and crowd in private finance. Now, in the other countries have, very big institutions, particularly China, but also, when you look at DBSA in the context of South Africa, or, Benitez in the context of Brazil, even most Latin American countries in relative sense have development finance institutions much bigger. And in the infrastructure space, and it is, our common friend Rakesh Mohan has stressed this many times, we need institutions like that. And it is now become quite fashionable in advanced countries to talk about green finance institutions playing this kind of a catalytic role. So, the UK set up a green investment bank. It was privatized, and now they're rethinking whether they need something. Canada has set something up. There's also been a continuing discussion in the US. But the main thing is, given the nature of the investments, the externalities surrounding those investments, can development finance institution play a bridge between the public good and private finance?
So, well, let me put this proposition, but maybe somebody else wants to will jump in. The last one, what we did try to do is something like a public-private thing, which was IDFC, right? Infrastructure Development Finance Corporation, which then became a pure private bank. It gave up its infrastructure functions, and presumably because it was not viable. Well, I can ask if anybody else of our speakers wants to comment on this issue of development finance. Yeah, please.
Sir?
Yeah, no, my Professor Tandon wants to speak. Yeah.
Dr. Virmani, I think you raise an important point. There is conversation on how to raise development finance for the climate related goals. One particular institution which has been set up, which has more of a private lens rather than a public lens, is NIF, which is actually making significant investments in renewables and in sectors which are aligned with transition. But of course, these make business sense. I think the other one, which we may look at as potentially useful, is NABFID. NABFID, the new one, which is still sort of, in work in progress. I suppose they've started with their activities, but perhaps is something or an institution to be looking at.
Professor Hale, do you have any experience of this?
Unfortunately not, but I think,
Okay.
Given the limited amount money international organizations and governments have, we should find the ways they can really work as a catalyst. So I can give you an example. In California, we have a development bank in California state. It's called iBank. And what it's doing is putting some money as a component of investment into the projects. And they ask for zero interest, but they want the principal back. And when they get the principal back, they put that money in the other project. That allows to attract private finance to contribute the rest of the money, because then they get all the returns. So I think we need to marry the sources.
So the issue is, do they develop special expertise? Because in principle, like Professor Tandon mentioned, public finance. I mean, that is a classic subsidy public finance. You can have what I have recommended based on my research was collateral subsidies, what I call,
right,
versus interest subsidies, etc. But in some sense, they can be done directly from the budget. But the case for some kind of a separate institution has to be a build-up of some expertise, which is not possible within the government system because of turnover, etc. So anyway, yeah. So I think maybe worth looking again at what's going on in the world and what is succeeding and what is not. Okay, I see. Yes, I'll just come to you. Does Oshima? I think Dr. Goyal is there. Is that Oshima? You want to say something?
Yes, thank you, Arvind. Yeah, I agree with this, Surabhi. I was just talking to someone at NIIF, and NABFID has given them a line of credit, they are going to use for some of their, so they have interesting structures. And because of all this climate finance becoming available, I think there's a lot of scope for these institutions, working with each other in order to leverage private finance. Also increasing information on domestic projects, this idea of a platform of viable projects, and using new technology to measure what's going on. So I say for carbon markets also. So there are many potential innovations, and I think NABFID has come up at the right time. And people started looking at BINDES and China Development Bank, and that India needed something like this, that they were working with the markets and they were successful. So, but I had one issue that I wanted to discuss, which is, Surabhi, you were presenting, and I think Amar said that the big change now is that technology has reached a level where you can actually transform the way you develop, and it's sort of sustainable and etc. So I think the literature does seem, or history or experience does suggest that what has really worked, very few things have worked, we are really behind, but what has worked much better than taxes and so on is innovation. So we have to be very careful in the policy instruments we use. If we're going to focus on carbon taxes or disincentives for firms, or we have to be very careful that the disincentives fall in a narrow area and there are awards or incentives somewhere else, because you don't want to discourage innovation. You want them to come in and contribute to innovation. The private sector has a lot of energy in innovation. But the problem of financing should not lead to huge taxes that then, because, the kind of things you were talking about where firms have to price in this and that will make finance much more costly, make things more costly for them. So it's important to have that demarcation. Then I had a question for Galina, which is about, a lot of these climate risks are like insurance events, not catastrophe events. So what about insurance as a way of pooling and reducing costs? Is there some work on the use of insurance in reducing the cost of climate finance? Yeah, thank you.
So Yeah, I mean, before I turn to Mr. Puri, yeah, I'm coming to you next, Mr. Puri. Yeah, I mean, the adaptation, the loss and damage stuff. Amar, you mentioned insurance there. I mean, why cannot whatever subsidies and other elements of finance be channeled through the insurance mechanism in a way? Is that possible? Or would any three of you want to comment on that? Related to the question which Dr. Goyal asked.
Oh, go ahead, Professor.
No, I just wanted to add that insurance is so ignored that I had it on my slide and I didn't talk about it. Yeah, so I think insurance products are actually quite relevant because they've been doing this for a long time. I just wanted to quickly jump in and take the opportunity to say that Dr. Goyal raised the point about the costs on investments from taxes. It's just a path correction. I also talked about incentives. So one way to do it is to raise costs, but at the same time, if you green, there could be some incentive structure involved, and perhaps could take into account what is a feasible rate of tax and not tax madly, to raise revenue, because it's difficult. Once a tax is put in place, I do recognize that, removing it is a challenge. So thank you so much. And sorry, Gail, please go ahead.
Oh.
Happy to comment on insurance
Yeah.
in the following sense. First, yeah, I mean, as Professor Hale correctly points out, I mean, if you have climate risks, then that means by definition you need mechanisms to reduce and pool risks, and insurance is the starting point. But looked at from the perspective of the kinds of events we are seeing and the kind of geographies of it, there are going to be dimensions of risk that are going to be outside not just individual firms and agents, but even outside countries. So if you look at some of the Caribbean countries and the numbers we look at, we see kind of losses, in the order of, not just 30 billion for Pakistan, which is about 10% of GDP, but, 60, 70, as high as 200% of GDP. That's not insurable for a country. So the kinds of mechanisms that, we are thinking about is, should we have mechanisms which, first of all, just like we see in the United States, incentivizes, let's say, behavior that doesn't take excessive risk. You shouldn't be building houses on floodplains, So you want to ensure that there is some kind of incentives to reduce risk. And that means also ensuring that the infrastructure that is built is more resilient. But then also, if a country is hit with a huge shock, perhaps one could say that any losses beyond a certain level would be covered by a loss and damage facility. And that's the discussions that we are having right now after COP27, which is what kind of magnitudes do we need for such a loss and damage facility, and how would it be dispensed? And there is also an issue of climate justice here, because most of the countries who are being most hit by this had nothing to do with the emissions that are there right now. So they are correctly saying, we didn't create this problem, and if we are being hit, we shouldn't be in a vicious cycle of climate and debt vulnerability.
Thanks. Okay, I think Mr. Puri has been holding his spot. Go ahead, Mr. Puri.
Dr. Virmani, thank you very much. Though I'm using a small little cell phone and therefore a little limited in terms of what I'm able to see. Apology. Dr. Virmani, Professor Charan Singh, thank you for this absolutely excellent, absolutely excellent presentation today. Dr. Bhattacharya, I am I'm an old timer in the trenches of the climate negotiations. You I haven't seen, but Nicholas Stern would recognize me very well. Now, I'm familiar with the work that you've done. We had Professor Lankes recently speak to us at a G20, T20 kind of a thing. And I want to thank you very much for all the points that you made. In particular, I want to draw attention of people to lower the cost of capital in developing countries. We use the MDBs. I think these are very, very important points. Let me make one point for all our colleagues here. You know, if we talk about $5 to $6 trillion being required annually, it may not be a macroeconomic problem because global savings are of the order of about 20 trillion a year. Almost all in the developed world. We need to find ways of moving the monies here. Let me give you practical examples. You know, for any of us to think that there would be huge amounts of industrialized countries, government monies flowing to developing countries, that to large developing countries like India, Indonesia, etc. People like me have fought for that all our lives, but the fact is that that's almost unlikely to happen. Hence, we have to find ways of lowering the cost of moving private capital from the developed countries to the large developing countries where you have the largest affected populations and who need to adapt and who need to do mitigation also in terms of climate change. So one very specific proposal that we've been talking about and we wrote, and if Professor Charan Singh can circulate that to the participants here, I'd be grateful, is a straightforward one, which is a large-scale hedging facility at the MDBs, perhaps the World Bank, which would allow lowering the cost of capital. Professor Bhattacharya, you know, till a year or so back, a major Indian company could borrow at a very low rate of interest overseas. But you know what the cost of capital, landed capital cost for the company here was? It was an order of magnitude of several times, which made it something just not affordable and not worth trying to do. Hedging is one side of it. And some experiments have been done, this TX facility between Europe and West Africa. But if we could use the G20 and other such fora to do a large-scale MDB institution, which would allow this kind of hedging, let me even put it to you, it can work akin to an insurance product. Large amounts of monies over large number of currencies. There would be some costs, but they can be priced. So this is a thought, this is an idea. It's not the perfect solution to everything, but it tackles one particular facet, and it's an important facet, that of foreign exchange costs, because that's where the monies are. And I want to thank you very much, and to all the others, you know, for highlighting these particular aspects and the use of these expressions, insurance, guarantees, foreign exchange, MDBs. I think they are particularly important. What we do in India is really a different matter. That's for us to do. But what do we do globally? And that's where I think the G20 can play a role. And you've mentioned Mr. Banga and so on. Good idea. It's a good time to try and work on something like this. And if we take it forward, maybe we'll do a contribution. Perhaps not everything, but at least some kind of a significant contribution. Thank you.
Professor Hale, you had some comment on some of the questions. Why don't you speak those?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the insurance question.
Yeah.
So it's true that a lot of the climate-related events cause uninsurable damages, partly because these are correlated risks, right? The flood, the wildfire, they affect large areas, and that's not something insurance companies can generally cover. In fact, like my house in California is not insured by private companies at all because it's in a flood and fire area. And so I'm getting state of California insurance. But the insurance companies are interested in reducing the risks because they want more business. And so I was just at a conference last week, which was a combination of scientists and insurance companies trying to figure out how to fund the adaptation projects. And the insurance companies are a way you can turn this avoided losses into a cash flow, because say, if I have a hotel on the beach and I'm subject to the storm surge, I can get lower premium on my insurance if there is some kind of protection against that storm surge, whether nature-based or a gray-green combination or something like that. And so insurance companies for sure need to play a big role in the structured finance that would attract private capital to solutions, especially adaptation solutions.
Correct.
Thank you. Charan, we've kind of run out. Okay, Dr. Kurian, quick questions or comment?
I have two pointed questions to Ms. Tandon. One is international, other is I am sitting in Kerala, relating to Kerala. The first question is, we know that the major polluters in the world are transnational corporations. So I take you to the 70s, and we had, as an integral part of the so-called new international economic order, there was the suggestion of UNCTC, United Nations Center on Transnational Corporations. So my question is, this is a grave international situation, and the major criminals are the transnational corporations. So can we go to the 70s and can we adapt some sort of an institutional mechanism to bring out a code of conduct? Also, making them to contribute to the climate finance. So that is one of my questions. The second question, I am sitting in Kerala, and I told you, our rubber farmers are in grave distress now because the price of rubber is relatively low when compared to its cost. And you know, the rubber plantations are, they are in carbon sequestration. They play a very creative role. So my question is, when you referred it to the fiscal economics, in a federal setup of India, is it not the moral duty or legal duty of the union government to look into these solutions? Thank you very much. I hope you got two questions.
We are past our time, so quick answers, please. Anybody?
Yeah, Dr. Virmani, I'll just make very quick answers. One is that on the code of conduct, for many years, as I said, that businesses are now being held responsible for their activities through investor action. So, you know, all these reporting standards are used to hold companies accountable. There are also legal frameworks where class action suits are brought against polluting companies. On the second one, there is a plan being drawn out. We already had the long-term strategy released last year. And I think, you know, what you're talking about, sequestration, etc., there needs to be a more thinking on what activities need to be funded. And perhaps on this, I do recognize that there are fiscal challenges. And I think there needs to be a rethink also within the Finance Commission on the basis of what funds need to be dispersed to differently affected areas on account of climate change. But I'll just stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charan or Dr. Vishandas, if there's some very quick point or question.
Yes, thank you, sir, and thank you all the speakers. I enjoyed, and it was a very excellent presentation. One quick, sir. In India, as our population is highest in the world, so is our livestock population also. We are the top country in terms of the livestock at 536 million, which is highest in the world. But our GHG emission is low despite this. And so how we can be on GHG emission and methane and other things, our farmers, the agriculture emission and the emission due to animals is quite low. So so how do you balance the equitable contribution for addressing the environmental issue?
Charan, you want to?
Well, I just had a very quick question, and that was, while other solutions are being thought through, many of the innovations that are taking place are very polluting. And I was looking very simplistic, the car manufacturing, the air conditioning, these are very polluting. And what would be the suggestions of three experts that how do we ensure that the innovations are far more responsible or climatically responsible?
Please go ahead and answer, anybody.
Let me just, first of all, I want to thank, Mr. Puri. I do know you, Mr. Puri, and I know the fight that you have been fighting, and for a long, long time. And as a result of that, we stand on higher shoulders. So thank you for that. I do think we are at the advent of getting some breakthroughs right now. As I said, we, as was pointed out, MDVs are totally irrelevant right now, but we have the prospect of kind of getting a much scaled up support, not only for their own financing, but for the kind of risk mitigation that you talked about, and for using blended finance to bring down cost of capital. So there are lots of possibilities. I've just spent 2 days at a meeting, including with the CEO of TCX, lots of other people. We are trying to think creatively around the risk proposition and around cost of capital. So stay tuned is all I can say. In terms of equity, so my principle of equity is twofold. One is everybody should do what is possible in their means to do without kind of being, penalized. For example, if it is cheaper to produce new energy from renewables, then it makes sense for you to do it, and it's not a penalty for you, which is the situation right now. Similarly, on agriculture right now, sustainable agriculture is not just about cutting methane, it's also about productivity. Agricultural productivity in India could be greatly improved through more sustainable agricultural practices. So we should be doing that anyway. Third, there are major equity issues about impact of climate change. Developing countries did not put the carbon out there. They are most adversely affected, and we need mechanisms to actually deal with that, not only in terms of loss and damage, but also in terms of just transitions. If India is to be asked to accelerate the phase out of coal, then the international community should be prepared to step up to support that in a just way. So there are, so I do think the justice issues matter, but I don't think harping on just the old 100 billion will help us. We need finance that is fit for purpose. I talked about the mobilization aspect, but I thought Professor Hale's presentation was extremely relevant because the transformation of the financial system is both for itself important, but also a powerful enabler of change.
Thank you. Professor Hale, and then concluding with Professor Tandon. You want to add anything, and we'll conclude?
I think this was really kind of a good summary and conclusion. On the agriculture specifically, I want to add that, we do need new technologies because we have optimized our crops to the highest yield given the past climate conditions. And those optimized crops no longer work when the climate conditions are changing, as opposed to like heirloom traditional crops, right? But heirloom traditional crops have lower yields. Growing in the shade has lower yields, but then it has a co-benefit of carbon capture, right? But then with the temperatures changing, maybe growing in the shade would be the only way in some hot areas we can actually continue to, have a reasonable agriculture that doesn't rely too much on water use and things like that. So we absolutely need ag tech innovation. Agriculture is no longer this like old sector where we just do things the way we did for thousands of years. That's the way to innovate. And India is an amazing position to take a lead on this because of the variety of climatic zones inside the country and the variety of the crops that India is growing. And so it's really an opportunity, I think, for technological development in the area which we usually don't associate with high tech, but we will have to if we're going to keep feeding growing population in a way that's consistent, sustainable, and just.
Good point. Maybe Dr. Vishendas, you can write a short paper for me on this.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Tandon, you can wind up the discussion.
Right.
Yeah, I'll just quickly make one comment that, pricing remains an important part. There's only as much the frameworks can do in terms of driving corporate behavior. And in terms of the question on, what are we doing in terms of the transformative economy as well, being compliant with our climate goals, I think there's enough thought on measuring emissions at all levels and building that within plans. Also looking ahead on what technologies will be compliant with this this goal that we set ourselves. So I'll just stop there and thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. I must say I have enjoyed it, this discussion more than I had expected. Also, given that I'm a bit sick, but thank you all, because you kind of reactivated my mind on some of the things which I haven't thought of for, I don't know, 10, 15 years or so. So it's good for getting my brain back in action. So thank you all. Thank you for the listeners who are still present. Charan, this is pretty impressive. So over to you.
Yeah, I must make one announcement. Professor Galina had sent me that they at the Santa Clara University Levy School of Business, they are calling for papers for a conference in June 9, 2023, and the topic is catalyzing private financial markets for climate solutions. The deadline for the papers is March 30, still have a few more days to go, and they will come back if they choose the paper by April 20. So I'm going to request all the listeners and my academic friends who are here today, if they want to submit a paper or even an abstract, they can do it by March 30. I would also like to mention one very important thing. Today's discussion, as Dr. Virmani mentioned, extremely interesting, very educative and informative. A person like me who's been in finance but never in climate finance also found it very, very informative and lots of learning. It'll be on our website tomorrow by noon, and we could use it for our classrooms or anywhere we want. The next week, we are again doing follow-up.
Charan's connection has been really bad. I don't know what's happening to him today. This is worse than ever I've seen. There's something wrong with his. Anyway, so are you still there?
But I understand.
No, we can't hear. Okay, you're back. Okay, just repeat the topic.
So next Friday, we are going to have another webinar on climate finance. And Montek will be joining us in that with 3 other experts. We continue and we talk about role of monetary and fiscal policy in climate finance. So that's going to be next Friday. Welcome all of you. And I hope I was audible when I made the announcement for the conference at Santa Clara. June 9, 2023 is the conference. We'll put it on our website too. So I would welcome all of you. Today's presentation and webinar will be available on our website by noon tomorrow. So thank you very much once again. I want to thank each one of you across the planet. Everybody is sitting and still we could put our minds together and talk about this important topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.